This is CultureCast. I'm Nova Safo. On today's program, mass shootings and the media. After Parkland, Florida, one idea gaining ground is for change in popular entertainment.
I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
Students at Parkland High School who survived the mass shooting there have something to say about that theory.
This isn't just a mental health issue. He wouldn't have harmed that many students with a knife!
Parkland students upend the usual mass shooting narrative, and the news media considers whether that narrative is too sanitized. That's all coming up on CultureCast.
CultureCast is a production of Chicago Radio Works. You can subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or the TuneIn app. You can also listen on our website, culturecast.org.
Welcome to CultureCast. I'm Nova Safo. The Parkland shooting that claimed the lives of 17 people has reignited the gun control debate and the mental health one. There's also been a third issue, the role of culture, specifically violence in mass entertainment in movies and video games. President Trump has zeroed in on that issue. Here he is a week after the shooting.
We have to look at the internet because a lot of bad things are happening to young kids and young minds, and their minds are being formed. And we have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it. And also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts. And then you go the further step, and that's the movies. You see these movies, they're so violent, and yet a kid is able to see the movie if sex isn't involved, but killing is involved, and maybe they have to put a rating system for that.
Following that statement, President Trump met with video game makers and others at the White House. Psychology experts are undecided on whether there is a cause and effect relationship between what's depicted in popular culture and entertainment and children's behavior in real life. But that hasn't stopped the blame game, which has been going on for decades. Here's a newsreel from the 1940s about the dangers of slot machines.
In New York City, the Little Flower was on an anti-gambling rampage. Gotham's colorful Mayor LaGuardia led police in smashing and jettisoning 1,200 slot machines.
Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia banned those machines in New York City. He also banned pinball machines, both blamed for attracting children and getting them hooked on gambling. Decades later, in 1999, came the mass shooting at Columbine High School.
If you are just joining us, two young men apparently dressed in long black trench coats opened fire about an hour and a half ago at a high school just outside of Denver in Littleton, Colorado.
Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold killed 13 people. Up until Parkland, it was the worst mass shooting at an American high school. Less than 2 months later, Hillary Clinton was at a podium at the White House.
As a nation, we've reacted to the shootings at Columbine High School like almost no other event I can remember in recent memory. It has literally pierced the heart of America.
She introduced her husband, then President Bill Clinton. The topic, violence in video games.
Already heard, members of the entertainment industry must also do their part. They and the rest of us cannot kid ourselves. Our children are being fed a dependable daily dose of violence, and it sells. Now, 30 years of studies have shown that this desensitizes our children to violence and to the consequences of it.
President Clinton ordered a government study. A year later, it was finished. The Federal Trade Commission said the entertainment industry engaged in, quote, pervasive and aggressive marketing of violent movies and video games aimed at children. In 2007, the FTC released another report. The entertainment industry is self-regulating, it said, but with mixed results. There's been no follow-up in the 11 years since. But now, after Parkland, violence in entertainment is a topic again. But the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School have countered that topic with a rallying cry. Guns are the problem, they say.
Our guns have developed at a rate that leaves me dizzy. The guns have changed and the laws have not.
Emma Gonzalez gave an impassioned speech just days after the shooting.
I found out today that there's a website called shootingtracker.com. Nothing in the title suggests that it is exclusively tracking the USA's shootings, and yet, does it need to address that? Because Australia had one mass shooting in 1999 in Port Arthur massacre, introduced gun safety, and they haven't had one since. Japan has never had a mass shooting. Canada has had 3, and the UK had 1, and they both introduced gun control, and yet here we are with websites dedicated to reporting these tragedies so that they can be formulated into statistics at your convenience. We know that they're claiming that there are mental health issues, and I am not a psychologist, but we need to pay attention to the fact that this isn't just a mental health issue. He wouldn't have harmed that many students with a knife!
The Parkland shooting and the one in Las Vegas at the country music concert had sounds and images of the attack itself recorded on cell phones by terrified victims. In Parkland, the images were of students cowering in classrooms.
Holy. Oh my God!
Months earlier in Las Vegas, a similar horror as 50 people were killed.
That's the AR.
After Las Vegas, there was talk of banning bump stock devices that turn semi-automatic assault rifles into machine guns. After Parkland, there's a significant shift in the gun control debate. Again, politicians are feeling the heat. The images are certainly one of the reasons why, and many journalists are now asking this question. If those images have been so powerful, images of the attacks themselves, has mass media coverage of past shootings been too sanitized? Nicole Dahman of the University of Oregon has studied that very issue.
We do have some evidence that suggests that images can hit us in the gut, right? Images can absolutely make us feel something. And so the argument is that audiences need an emotional connection with news to really connect to it and then take action. So if a graphic image can connect with us emotionally and make us feel that shock, that horror, that disgust, that anger, then we might be more inclined as an audience member to take action, which is, what we need for a functioning democracy.
Is that why Parkland has been different, that there has been more calls to action? There seems to be a switch in the conversation in the gun debate. Is it because there were images, there were video of the shooting actually happening?
Well, what we saw from the videos that were taken from inside, from the high school students, is we did hear the sound and we saw students hiding, and that sheer panic of what it's like to be in that moment really came through. But what we still didn't see were those images of the bloodshed, right? We didn't see the reality of what bullets do to bodies. So we still had this sort of visually bloodless representation of mass shootings. But what we have seen since Parkland is this new visual narrative that we haven't seen before of a mass shooting, and that is these images of resistance. So we've seen these high school students standing up, taking action, illustrating courage, really illustrating that resilience and calling for change, both from the public and from our elected leaders. And so that's a new visual narrative and really a new, audio and written narrative that we haven't seen come out of a mass shooting before.
And have they so far been as powerful as in the past examples of graphic images that have moved the public conversation?
Historically, and especially if we look to the Vietnam War, there is some evidence that suggests that horrific images from the Vietnam War really led to a change in public opinion and a decline in public support for American involvement in the Vietnam War. And most notably, the image that we often think of is the Nick Oots image of a young, naked Vietnamese girl running down the street, screaming out in, sheer pain from the napalm burn that she had just sustained. And so there's a lot of evidence that suggests, some evidence that suggests that particular image really swayed public opinion. Not all scholars, however, agree with that, right? Some scholars suggest, public opinion was already declining post-Pentagon Papers. But historically, we do have this conventional wisdom that images can serve as a catalyst, right? That images can help us to be inclined or galvanized to take action. And another example more recently is if you look to the Syrian refugee crisis, and we had just that horrific image of a drowned Syrian boy, face down on the beach, the waves lapping his face. And so here we had this reality, a human face, a little Island Kurdi, to the Syrian refugee crisis. And so what we saw from that image was this sort of immediate public and governmental reaction. So as an example, donations to Red Cross spiked. Some countries opened their borders, some a little bit more. But what we actually saw, though, was that it was this short-term reaction as opposed to this long-term humanitarian response.
Behind the scenes, I understand that media newsrooms have been debating this forever. How much do we show, how much do we not show? What is the argument against showing these images if there is a chance that they could save lives, that they could change the conversation?
Journalism operates under a code of ethics. So when we're talking about professionally trained journalists in credible newsrooms, those journalists are tasked with these moral imperatives of seeking truth, right, informing audiences for a functioning democracy versus minimizing harm. And so the argument is that if the information in an overly graphic photo can help audiences understand the situation, right, and lead to an informed populace in a democracy, then news organizations have an obligation to run that photograph. However, you also have to think about the subject of that photo, right? And when we're talking about graphic photographs, we're often talking about bloodshed, right? People severely injured in this very emotionally draining, physically, challenging moment for them, right? These images often depict moments of death. So by showing these images, are we potentially exploiting that victim? Are we adding to the grief of survivors of that particular incident? And so it's really this ongoing discussion that we need to think about. And from a journalistic perspective, those decisions are, made based on the fact of, what is the overriding need to see? What is in this image that the public needs to see for an informed democracy? And what is the journalistic responsibility to report that story, balanced with, invasion of privacy?
Looking at some of the Vietnam War images, one of them won a Pulitzer Prize of a police sergeant, I believe he was, pointing his gun just as he pulled the trigger to kill a man who was, I think, a Viet Cong spy or something. And those kinds of images, it's hard to imagine those kinds of images being published now in American news organizations. Is our news more sanitized now than it used to be, or is it that those images are getting published and it's just that we're so saturated that they don't have the same kind of power and play that they used to?
Right. Well, what we tend to see in our American news media are images of distant suffering. So images of foreign children on foreign lands, images of starvation in foreign countries. What we don't tend to see as much of are graphic images that take place in our own backyard. So, for example, in a post-9/11 world, American news media were very hesitant to show images of slain American soldiers or, forbidden access to photograph, the remains of killed American soldiers coming home from, Iraq and Afghanistan for fear of looking unpatriotic. And so we have had in recent years, this sort of decline of overly graphic images when it comes to American soil. Enter the age of digital news and social media, and a lot of that is changing because now we live in an age in which we have citizens with their cell phones and their camera phones on them to capture the moment, and then it spreads rapidly across social media. But, as you said earlier, and I want to follow up on this point because it's an important one, we now, again, because of 24-hour news, Twitter, social media, digital news, we live in this age in which we're oversaturated with images of horror. And so it is increasingly difficult for any one image to sort of stand out in the sea of horrendous images.
Are you seeing any examples of news organizations trying to combat that, or are they throwing in the towel? I mean, how are they dealing with this?
When it comes to thinking about, mass shootings, and I've looked extensively at the coverage of mass shootings, specifically school shootings, we have seen this very routine pattern of coverage from the news media. You go in there, report the breaking details, speculation from the scene, number of victims, number of injured, speculation about the perpetrator, this debate then about gun control versus the right to bear arms, mental illness, coverage of the memorials, coverage of the funerals. And so it's this sort of same cycle repeated over and over and over again. And so that makes us become a little bit more numb to that coverage because it's a story that we've seen before. But in the case of Parkland, what we've seen that's new this time are these images of resistance. And so I think these new visuals and these new narratives that we're seeing from these high school students, potentially has the ability to give us this new perspective and to kind of shake us from our complacency. One of the things, too, that, when it comes to the release of, say, these crime scene photos, or if we were to have a situation in which the news media did have access to the crime scene itself, right, and to the reality of what bullets do to bodies, some of my concern with how those images may be used is thinking about what they might look like on a cable TV news channel, in which we often have split screens and these talking heads and then the running text and the sensationalized, breaking news header. And so my concern there in that presentation is that all of that then tends to lessen the impact of the visceral horror of those graphic images. Same thing on social media. We scroll through social media, we see this manipulated, sensationalized social media feed in which we might have this incredibly graphic image of a victim, and then right next to it you have an image of a pet, and the latest recipe. And so in this social media presence, it's just so easy for us to become voyeurs and, not really have that strong emotional impact.
Nicole Dahman is a media studies professor at the University of Oregon. And that's CultureCast for this week. Remember to subscribe to our webcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or the TuneIn app. Just search for CultureCast from Chicago Radio Works. I'm Nova Safo in Chicago. Thanks for listening.